welcome to Tag1 Team Talks, the blog and podcast of Tag1 Consulting. To commemorate the 20th anniversary of Drupal, we're doing an interview series with community leaders to talk about their Drupal journeys, how Drupal has transformed their personal and professional lives, what Drupal means to them, and their thoughts on the future of the platform and the community. I'm Michael Meyers, the Managing Director of Tag1, and I'm honored and excited to welcome Josh Koenig, the co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer of Pantheon. Welcome, Josh. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Hey, thanks for having me, Michael. I'm excited about this conversation.
So before we get started, I love origin stories. And before we dig into Drupal, I'm super curious because so many people that I know, including myself, studied one thing and then did another. You have a background, you have a BFA in drama from NYU. I'm really curious, how did you go from that immediately into technology? And did your background in drama help you to this day?
It's a great question and a decent story. And I mean, the short answer is yes, it has. But the way it worked for me was I was a computer kid, literally as like a kid with my like Commodore VIC-20, loading up the basic prompt and like making like little things happen with that. But I was all like self-taught, right? I kind of like, I had that Commodore, and then like my mother was a graphic designer, so she had a Macintosh in the house, and I would like mess around with that and wanted to like write video games like I think most teenagers do, and had gotten pretty good at technology. Was lucky enough in my high school at the time in the late 90s to actually get introduced to a bunch of stuff around like early web, and like we built a web version of the high school yearbook at one point, which was a great early experience. So like I had this kind of interest in technology, but very autodidactical. And at the same time, I was also very interested in arts and theater and writing and other stuff like that. And I had a sort of a friend of my parents, pseudo mentor, who he had a career as a shareware author. This is like going way back in the world of computer. There used to be this thing called shareware before there was the internet, where it was like, okay, it's fine to pirate or distribute copies of the software, but just if you do, send me a check, please. Just like send me $15, and like he wrote like a couple like graphics programs and like lived a comfortable life as a result of his shareware. And what he said to me was, Josh, you're probably not going to like computer science school in a university. It's just not your style. At the time, especially like, again, this is like 96, 97, this was, you would go and it would be like, let's go back and teach you like Fortran or COBOL or maybe like intro to like Java had only been just introduced and was not like standardizing the curriculum. And he said, what I advise you to do is go to school for whatever you're most passionate about, but get a job. Go to school for what your heart most desires, but find work in technology. You won't have a problem finding a job if you hustle a little bit. You're smart. You'll figure it out. In retrospect, that's really high risk advice. But it worked out well for me. I got into this conservatory program at NYU, which I was a little bit surprised. I surprised myself with that because it's a competitive program to study theater, which I was very much into. And then I started at least as a freshman, I started working in the computer lab just because that was the first thing. But via people I met in the computer lab, I found other, slightly better paying, much more interesting work. And essentially, while I was getting my BFA in theater, like doing like literal singing, dancing, like movement classes, and Shakespeare and other fun stuff, I was essentially getting a journeyman apprentice course in how to build web applications, like working with Sun Solaris to like stick together a Postgres database and a Perl front end to run very rudimentary kind of online applications, like a sort of a calendar syncing application, a couple other things like that. And it was like good technical experience. It was like the heady days of Silicon Alley. So I also got to see like some business practices that were unorthodox, and learned a little bit from that too, I think. But what kind of happened for me was that, I graduated, and by the time I was in my final year of theater school, I sort of realized that I was not going to be able to pay my rent as an actor. I've paid exactly 2 months rent with acting, which I am proud of, but like that, I mean, it's really hard. It's an incredibly difficult thing to do, to make a career out of being an actor, because you have to just relentlessly audition for stuff that you're not that interested in, and be super stoked when you get 5 seconds in that 7-Eleven commercial, because that means you can pay your rent for a few months and maybe you'll get an agent. And it wasn't for me. I wasn't going to be able to. I just didn't have it in me, and I realized that. And so I kept doing art for fun and just like doubled down on tech for work, mostly freelancing early on, because I think my mom was like a little bit of a role model for that. She was a freelance graphic designer for a bunch of her career, and so as a result of freelancing, working with a bunch of interesting people, working with, kind of following that self-taught path of like, okay, I'll take on a new job that's going to stretch me a little bit, but I'll learn it as I go. And, by this time you could go online and like use the web to learn about pretty much anything you want to do. So it all just worked for me over a few years to kind of like build up my technical chops to where they were when I first encountered Drupal.
Wow. Business is a lot about storytelling. I know you give a lot of presentations both to investors and audiences. And so I'm sure that drama background has helped you tremendously in many aspects of your professional life, even if you didn't go into acting.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I skipped over that part of the question. It's like a superpower, right? Like, I like got trained in a really, really rigorous environment for several years to be absolutely comfortable walking up in front of hundreds of people, kind of knowing what I'm doing and just riffing. And so, like the idea of you're going to present at a conference in a big room, there's some nervousness that like any human gets a little bit of butterflies in their stomach, but I have like, it doesn't ruffle me at all. I'm not worried about it. In fact, I really enjoy it. I like to, get the opportunity to put together a really good presentation and deliver it really well, and like get people in the audience engaged. Like that's a very rewarding feeling. And there's a part of me is kind of like wishes I could actually do more of that in my career, because it is personally really, really satisfying to deliver a great talk, in the same way that it was very satisfying for me, to put on a great show in an actual theater. But yeah, it's a little bit of a superpower, and it's definitely helped me. I don't think I would be where I am today if I didn't have that.
That's an awesome way to look at it. A superpower. Risky advice or not, it sounds like it is a great way to go. I love it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I like to be cognizant of like survivor bias and all these things. Like I like have a lot of things going for me, like just coming out of the gate. And I was lucky in a lot of ways, and I also worked very hard. So like I mean that's a huge part of it. But yeah, I don't know whether the path that worked for me is advisable for everyone else, but it did work for me.
Well, you've been a member of the Drupal community now for just over 18 years. Your UID is 3,313. The early UIDs, there's a lot of blank space in there. So that makes you among the first 100, a few hundred, maybe 1,000 of people to discover, use, and create a Drupal.org account. I'm curious how you found it. How did you discover Drupal so early?
Yeah, this is a good story. So I like to say I got into Drupal because I was trying to take over the government. So being a technology freelancer, living in New York City in the early aughts, it was a really interesting and unique time to be a New Yorker for sure. And I've always been kind of politically active, since my youth. And I just didn't want like I didn't want the war to happen, the Iraq war. I was like, this is a really big mistake. This is a really bad idea. This is not going to end well. We're doing this for a bunch of wrong reasons. This is transparently a propaganda operation. This is not the way it should be. And so I got involved in all the protest organizing that was going on in and around New York City. And New York City had some of the largest anti-war protests in 2002 and early 2003 anywhere in the world. And that was a lot of work. I met a lot of interesting people. And had a lot of interesting experiences, but ultimately those protests were a complete failure. They did nothing. They had absolutely no effect. It just like the president was like, I don't take foreign policy advice from a focus group, and just said, go fuck yourself. And that made me rethink, like, okay, the stakes here are pretty high. This doesn't work. What might work? Well, you need to change who the president is. That means I need to start caring about the election cycle. And I got really into this at the time, kind of like a dark horse candidate named Howard Dean, who was using the internet he wasn't the first candidate to use the internet, but he was the first national presidential candidate in the US to use the internet effectively. And what he did was, he was a governor of Vermont, no national name recognition, was like at 1% in the polls, but he was one of like two people in the Democratic Party that was actually willing to say this war is a and by the way, we should like have universal health care and a few other things that like we're still working on now, to be honest. But he was sort of like out front and loud and proud about that, and at the time, I don't know if you recall, like at the time, you couldn't get that message out in the traditional media, right? It was almost like forbidden to speak out against this stuff in any national news, and so he used the internet really effectively to get that message out. And I received that message via the internet, and I got really excited about it. And I had this thought process, which was like, wait, I know how to make the internet. Here's a candidate who's using the internet. He's got the message that I believe in. Instead of like doing something really good volunteer work, but kind of pedestrian or commodity, like gathering signatures or like making protest signs, like I've got skills that are rare and valuable that could be applied to this really, really important project. I should get into this. And so I got really into this campaign, and this is how I met, my business partner of almost 20 years now, Zach, because he did the same thing. Zach had set up a website that was called Hack4Dean with a 4. It was just like on his summer vacation from college, and it was just like a mailing list with a bunch of total rando wild like people joined this thing. Like one of the original spec authors for XML was in there. Like Cory Doctorow was like emailing in, and like it was like this whole thing of like, we got to do something, and like nobody knew what to do. And so what we arrived on after like about 6 weeks of like just incredibly intense like mailing list and IRC chatter was we should create campaign in a box software for all of the affinity groups that are springing up around this campaign, because we started to get traction, starting to move up in the polls, started to raise money online effectively, which everybody then had to pay attention to, and then you can spend more on advertising, you raise your name brand recognition. It was like there was a flywheel working for this campaign, and it was a lot of grassroots stuff. It was a lot of like kind of bottoms up organizing. And so we said, well, there's all these affinity groups, they all need websites, because that's how we're getting the message out. So we wanted to create campaign in a box software for all of the volunteer grassroots affinity groups around the campaign. And the internal thing was, well, we obviously can't write this from scratch. We don't have the time. Let's look through the world of open source and see what could be a fit to start as a place to build. And the story goes, I actually wasn't there for that, but the story goes that Neil Drum, who was part of this project as well, went into the #PHP IRC channel on Freenode and said, what's a good content management system? And 3 people said Drupal, and that was it. We picked Drupal, and we had evaluated like a couple others, like PHP Nuke, PHP BB. WordPress was, I don't know if I think it might have still been called BBPress at that point in time. And Drupal felt like the right fit because it had the ability to handle multiple types of content was like kind of a core thing in there. It had some like good inbuilt RSS support. We were really high on like RSS is going to be a way to coordinate these, and we actually did. We created like a national syndicated RSS network for events. So like the national campaign could propagate out events via RSS to all these other websites and have them show up and like basically create a coordinated global calendar. So yeah, we picked Drupal to build this thing. We rebranded it as Dean Space because Hack for Dean sounded scary to some people, and built this, in the course of like 3 months, built this like what, in retrospect, you could squint at and look at and call like an installation profile or a Drupal distribution for the campaign. It ran hundreds of affinity groups, like, pilots for Dean, teachers for Dean, farmers for Dean, whatever. And then the campaign itself used it for their state level or like organizing things, like their like Iowa website, New Hampshire website, California website, whatever. Those were all using that software. And Zach actually went to join the campaign and moved to Burlington, and some people actually joined up with the campaign. A bunch of other people remained like volunteers on the outside like I did. But that was how I found Drupal. And it's interesting, we spent like a good, I think in that first 3 months, in that burst of activity, I didn't get involved in the Drupal community really at all, because we were just like really on the outside focused on just building with this thing. And it was only when we got sort of past that initial burst that we realized that there's a whole wealth of knowledge and information inside this community that we could start tapping into. And so like that was actually a self-interested thing as it got to be like the end of 2003 to like go and start engaging, not just reading doc pages, but actually engaging in the Drupal community. And then like we had like always thought, we should give back some of the code we're writing. So thinking about what do we have to do to actually release some of the stuff that we created and so forth. Yeah, so that was my intro to the Drupal community, and that got followed up because the Dean campaign was obviously not successful. It was actually unsuccessful in a rather like spectacular fashion, and which was kind of heartbreaking, to be honest. Like we put a lot of our passion into that, and it just like went from could actually work, might actually take over the government, to like, no, not going to happen in like a week. But a bunch of people sort of kept going after that. I worked for a nonprofit that was. I found work with a sort of national nonprofit that was generally aligned with, wasn't like a campaign, particular candidate sort of thing, but it was like trying to do online organizing and activism from a progressive standpoint. And we kept using that technology stack. So I got more and more into Drupal over the course of 2004 as I was like helping with this Music for America project. And Zach started Civic Space, which was basically, let's take the concept of Dean Space and make it nonpartisan, totally open source, like for all the NGOs in the world. Because at the time, the nonprofit tech world was like really dominated by some not so great legacy proprietary, what you would call today SaaS platforms, but they were just not awesome, right? It was like very rudimentary tools, no ability to really like work on like what the actual digital experience was, and like really expensive for these NGOs to run. So there was the idea to create an open source alternative to all those things, which was pretty successful. Yeah, so that was like, through that like kind of crucible, I ended up on the other side, like having not actually in a position to start giving back to the Drupal community probably about a year after I first got into it.
Oh, Dean Space, I remember that campaign vividly. And Dean Space revolutionized American politics online. I mean, I think you really undersold it. I mean, it really became the model by which every campaign was run, moving forward. It was transformative. And it was also the first major, success on the map for Drupal. I don't think I would have discovered Drupal if not for that, and that was sort of that, when you go to use a platform, you say, well, who else has used it? What has been done with it? And, I was like, oh my gosh, that, Dean, so it was a major reason that I got into the community and ended up using it for my company. So after Gene Space, Music for America, I think it's interesting that you spent a little bit of time at Trellin, and I just want to mention that I don't think Trellin is around anymore, unfortunately. At least there was a 404 on their site when I checked it out this morning. But so many amazing people at some point in time spent a stint at Trellin, especially a lot of like early people in the community, like Morbasif, who did the IRC chatbot, and Jim Gilliland, who's on the security team. It blows my mind the number of amazing people that at some point were touched by Trellin. So then you went on after all that in around 2006, if I recall, which is roughly Drupal 4.5. You teamed back up with Zach Rosen and Matt Cheney, and you guys formed ChapterThree. What led you guys to come together and create a Drupal agency?
That's a great question too. So let me see if I can roll. I can talk a little about Trellin, because I think like there's a bridge point that's in there too. So okay, by the end of 2004. And like the actual presidential election cycle, which was also heartbreaking. Like I was just totally burnt out. Early 2005, I was like, I need a break. I can't do politics right now. I need to do something else. I need to figure out a way to just hit the reset button on my life. So I started. I basically couch surfed for like 3 or 4 months. In between San Francisco and New York City, and then I got together with like my 2 high school best friends, and like we pooled all of our money and did like a 3-month cross country road trip, which was actually like. This is like not about technology, but it was actually for me really, I mean, it was a lot of fun, first of all, but I like at the point where I was like being so like burnt out on politics and the election and the campaign, like spending time just like traveling through the country and like meeting regular totally regular old people in places like Texas and Alabama and Georgia, we spent time in all these like red states, right? It was really, I think, very positive for me in an interesting, like kind of healing way. And like we put a travel blog up of the whole thing, obviously running on Drupal. And I think that's still online if people want to can search for it. Vagabender.org. And at the end of that, I came back to my home in Oregon, to my mom's place, and we parted ways at the end of the road trip, and I was like basically broke. Like I was like, okay, Mom, I need to move in with you for a little while because I need to figure out what I'm doing next. And I started like looking for a Drupal job because now I had these skills. And like in the intervening time, like the Drupal economy had started to really develop between 2004 and 2006. Or this was like summer 2005. So like over that year and a half, this like Drupal economy had started to develop, and there were now these Drupal agencies that were out there. And I emailed all of them. I think there were like 6 or 7. And Mike Haggerty got back to me right away. He was like, "Hey, I will put you to work tomorrow." And I was like, "Great, that's what I need." And I think honestly, like his like, I move fast. I like hire people when they come in. I know how to spot talent. Like I think that is a big part of why so many people have spent time working. Did spend time working for that company. And yeah, so I worked there for about 8 or 9 months and worked on some interesting projects. I met some other really interesting. I had a connection to that also through Andrew Hoppen, who had been involved in the Dean Space, Civic Space stuff, and met some of my colleagues at the time who were really really great people too. And it was with Mike and co that we went to Vancouver, British Columbia for the Open Source CMS Summit in like, I think it was like January or February of 2006. And that to me was like, it lit the spark again, because it was the first real like in-person Drupal. It was actually, I think, the first in-person like big tech thing I had ever been to. That wasn't like that wasn't like, you know, strolling around the halls at like Macworld, which is a bit like a consumer experience. This is like, here are the people. And like, we went to the Bright offices in Vancouver, and like Boris Mann like gave a big speech, and like all these, you know, people were there. And it wasn't just Drupal people. There's like Matt Mullenweg was like hanging out, and the power of that community and the people who were there, you know, looking at a shared opportunity and the chance to do something, you know, it was this idea of like, okay, you know, there's potentially commercial interest here and people are starting businesses, but we're in a, like this idea of co-opetition, and we're building a commons that everybody can like leverage, was really, it really resonated with me. And I was, you know, and still am to this day, like a big believer that the internet is going to be is and will be a huge net positive for humanity, and an important part of how we actually navigate the 21st century as a species. And like, you know, being able to be a part of that community that's working on making better tools to build the internet for people. It sort of rekindled that same like passion in me that I hadn't felt for at least a few years. And I got really excited and got more involved in the community, and that was sort of you know, I just had a lot more ideas of my own, and like, this is what I want to do, this is where I want to take things, and it wasn't possible to do all that while I was working full time, like doing client work, and so I had to leave the job that I had without anything else lined up. Actually, what I did was I was kind of talking to all my friends about like my kind of dilemma, and like I feel like I'm a little bit stuck. And one of my friends that I had been on this road trip with, he lives like in like remote Northern California, and he said, "Listen, man, why don't you come out here just for the summer? I have the internet too, and your rent could be like $200 a month." And I said, "That's not a bad idea. Let's try that." And so I went and lived in a town called Trinidad, which is way on the northern coast of California. And I started going back down to San Francisco, and then I reconnected with Zach and Matt, and we had like very similar, we reconnected with Zach, and through Zach, Matt, they had been at UIUC together. And we had a lot of the same ideas, and kind of what we landed on was, you saw like, oh, okay, so like, you know, Mike did Trellon, and you know, Jeff and Matt did Lullabot, and there's like, you know, Bright did their thing, so we could start our own thing. We could be our own bosses. We could call the shots. We could decide what it is we want to do. And that was where like the idea for ChapterThree came from, of just like we could kind of try to chart our own course in this emerging Drupal economy, and be able to work on the things we wanted to work on. And yeah, and so like that summer of 2006, we decided to go for it and sort of like throw in together to see if we could get this thing off the ground.
And get it off the ground you did. I think where we first met is that open source CMS conference in Vancouver.
Yeah.
I was racking my brain this morning before we chatted. I mean,
yeah, totally. Yeah. Because you were you working with Bright and Co, or no? You were with this was sorry, your early career. From that, what was the name of the news site that you were sort of like the CTO of?
Yeah, I started a company called Now Public,
Yes.
which was the first venture-backed Drupal-based startup. And Boris Mann is another key reason that I use Drupal. I sat down with him in Vancouver. He gave me like tons of his time, and he was like, "This is why it's a good platform versus everything else that's out there," you know. And he was, you know, a major reason. And then Now Public ended up sharing and buying office space with Bright. Like our two companies were co-located for gosh, the first 2 years of Now Public, and then they merged with Rain City and kicked us out because they needed
the space. Yeah.
And we found office down the street. They had a gorgeous office on the water in Vancouver. So I mean, ChapterThree, is still going strong today. You ran it day to day for 15 years. And then, I'm curious because I remember being in your office and talking to Strauss, before Pantheon was real. And I don't remember who all was at the table, but I remember being in the conference room, and Strauss is always blowing my mind, with this amazing idea and vision. And I think back to that conversation, and so much of what you guys were talking about in that room has come true today with Pantheon. And so I'm curious, how did you go from, okay, we have a digital agency to we want to create Pantheon?
That's a good story too. So I'd say this is a place where some of this was it was the experience we had at ChapterThree and like a little bit what we were seeing around us. And it was the experience, both positive and in some cases, not so positive. So ChapterThree, started with three guys, and we grew it over like really 4 years from the three of us to about 30 people, kind of that like boutique agency size where like the next level of the game is figuring out how to scale management and client services and other stuff that and to be frank, that at that point in our lives, none of us were passionate about those sorts of challenges. And but we had done it all completely bootstrapped, right? Just with our own grit and, not taking a paycheck sometimes so we could pay other people. And it was like a great experience, honestly. I would say, well, we can talk later on some of the things that we were able to do in the community during that time. I think were really, really positive. But as it pertains to Pantheon, I think what was happening for us was, we came up with the agency, and the agency grew and Drupal grew, and we started working with bigger and more exciting and interesting and challenging customers. And we started running into a lot of common patterns of problems, regardless of what the website we were building was, who it was for, what the design was. Those are all created like very different Drupal development challenges that were kind of unique. Or more or less unique to the project, but there were these more fundamental kind of meta operational challenges that we kept running into, and the solutions we developed for those were like converging on like getting just incrementally better based on our experience. And the challenges were around how do we make a team of developers effective together, especially if that team might include people from different organizations. Like if you work on larger projects, maybe there's more than one agency involved, maybe there's some subcontractors, maybe there's some developers or IT people from the client side that are participating in the process. How do you make that work so that you're not stepping on each other's toes, so that you can effectively collaborate, so that you can review, so that you can have transparency, so that you can integrate. And then like when you want to launch a website, how do you make it scale? That was one of the big things that David was really instrumental in with PressFlow, was really proving that you could scale Drupal. In fact, actually going back to the campaign days, just as a quick aside, like you're totally right. Like I don't know, I would say it's a stretch to say that Dean Space in particular laid down the track for digital organizing and presidential stuff going forward. But I mean, it was a part of that. But like quite literally, the core digital team from the Dean campaign founded an agency called Blue State Drupal that then was the Obama tech operation. Like the same people, the same core group. And I remember having like a very late and loud conversation with one of their principals in like at Netroots Nation 2007 maybe, and I was trying to tell them that they should use Drupal for more stuff, and they were like, no, Drupal can't scale. You got to do it like movable type does. You gotta write out the static files so that you can scale it, because we have really big scale challenges. And at the time, he was kind of right. it was Drupal's had like some internal, like pretty good, honestly, at the time relative to other open source projects. So the internal capabilities to scale with like page caching and stuff, right? The sort of stories of like Drupal can survive a slash dotting, which was not true of every software, but like it really wasn't ready to take on, like out of the box, it wasn't ready to take on sustained large scale traffic loads. Like that was a kind of, you needed to do extra work to make that happen. And as we were working on these larger projects, right, at ChapterThree, we had to do that extra work over and over and over again. So these twin operational challenges of how do we get teams of developers to work together effectively? How do we make websites that can scale? And we developed good expertise in those, like through like the School of Hard Knocks to some extent. And then what happened was, I guess two things happened that started to like spark the idea that eventually became Pantheon. One, you go to now there was DrupalCon, right? And DrupalCon's amazing. And so DrupalCon, like you have your case study track where people tell their success stories. And then you have your like hallway track or your happy hour track where people sometimes talk about the not so success stories, which are interesting. And I remember talking to other peers in the digital agency space, and you can kind of talk about like projects that went off the rails or clients from hell, whatever, kind of stuff you commiserate about. And a lot of the really harrowing stories that other agency owners had to tell had these same features where like, yeah, we were getting a little bit behind. So we tried to add more developers. That actually slowed things down. We got more behind. So we really had to like really do like a really big push to get to the launch date. Then the website went live and then it crashed. And so then we had to like put in like another like super sprint just to get things stable. And they're kind of stable now, but like nobody wants to touch anything. And also the client's telling me they're not going to pay me the final installment because of all the problems, and they want a discount, and I still have to pay my people. And like it was like, oh gosh, this is difficult. This puts people's oh sorry, I think my internet got unstable for a second. I'll pause. I am back.
Yep.
So I can go back. So these are real. These challenges have real world consequences. Like it's websites, right? We're not like nobody's going to live or die if their website is up or down. But it really does affect people's like stress levels and like and if your client doesn't pay you and you can't pay your staff, then your business will unravel. We thought, oh gosh, there's a real need for this stuff, and we were doing pretty well at it. I not to toot our own horn, we were pretty good at this stuff, but it was like expensive, right? It's like, okay, I have to convince the client to hire me and like my two most senior tech folks to do like 6 weeks of work up front before they'll see anything, before they even see like hello world with Drupal. And like at our hourly rates, like that's expensive. Like you're talking about people that can like make like a high 5, low 6-figure investment up front just in workflow and infrastructure. That really makes it a luxury product that not everyone can afford. And so our realization was that there was a real need to make this. There was a need to make this kind of operational capacity that we were good at building as a one-off much more available. And so the first thing we did was we tried to open source it. We got together and like, this was still ChapterThree and David was still at 4 Kitchens. We had worked together on a couple of these projects. So we were collaborating around this stuff. And so I went out and I made these Amazon machine images. Like this is early days of AWS, and you could make an EC2 machine image and make it publicly available. This is like it was like, whoa, revelation. We made one for to showcase that you could use Drupal with Varnish so that it could scale, called Mercury. We made one with like a Jenkins continuous integration setup called Vulkan, and then we made one that showcased like that you could run Agar like to do multi-site. they got some interest, and in particular, like the Mercury one, people were just like, oh, cool. So where do I pay you for support for this, right? Like you're gonna sell this to me, right, and maintain it for me. And I was like, no, I'm not. I'm relabeling all of this alpha not for production use, because I don't want, like, as an open source project, I don't want that. I can't take that kind of responsibility. And in our but it sort of demonstrated that, again, there was this real need there. And so, partly kudos to Zach for being like ambitious and visionary enough to think we could do it. But we were like, hey, we live in San Francisco. Look at what's going on around us. Like, we could maybe start we could start a new kind of company. We like beat level 1 of the agency game, but we don't need to play level 2. We could play a different game and actually make a product. We could build a platform. And yeah, we need to work on that a lot to make it actually responsible to put in anyone's hands, but like we could raise money and do that. And so we like finagled our way into having dinner with like the founders of Heroku, and these pretty successful at the time platforms and service. Like they're like Ruby guys. They're like from LA. They were very cool. They still are very cool. Very stylish individuals, and they were just like, you guys got to do this. And we'd love to have dinner again, but not if you're not even decided you're going to do this. You got to do it. And so we decided to do it, and it worked out. So again, more high risk advice that went in our favor. Fired ourselves from our jobs at the agency, stopped taking a paycheck to really like make it real, and went out and raised a little bit of money to build a beta version of the platform, and then use that to raise enough money to build a real version of the platform, and kind of took it off from there.
I got to ask, when you guys started out, did you ever in your wildest dreams think you were going to build $1 billion company?
In our wildest dreams, yes. Like that's the and the thing is that like that's part of the like that's what those mechanics are what make Silicon Valley venture capital work. You can't raise money from people if you don't credibly have an ambition to build something that could be that successful. It's a weird thing, and again, I say like high risk advice because it's a little bit like the music industry. It's a hit driven business. Only 1 out of 7 of these of the VC backed projects will even make it to any kind of success, and it's like 1 in 20 or less is a meaningful success, and it's like the 1 in 100 that really make people's portfolios. So what they're looking for is people who are going to swing for the fences and like have a vision that you could, again, you're thinking like, okay, I can squint and see how in 10 years, if these trends continue and these guys can execute, or guys and girls now, thankfully, can execute, it could be a really big deal. So like we had this idea, like, hey, we want to run a non-trivial percentage of the internet. And if we do that, like, yeah, that's a $1 billion business. We got a long ways to go, to be honest, but we have, I ran some stats the other day, and we get over 1 billion unique visitors to some website on Pantheon every month, which is about 30% of the internet browsing human population. And yeah, we've got a long ways to go still. So.
That's amazing. That's mind blowing. I think you have to believe, if you're going to start a business, you have to believe, hubris or not, you have to believe that you can get there, or, you have no business starting a venture backed business for that matter. You can start a lifestyle business, but you're not going to get very far in the venture world. So we've talked a lot about your professional history in Drupal. A big part of Drupal is its open source nature. Its success is the community. A good segue, I know Pantheon does a lot for the community. You guys are the top sponsor of every major event. You are a top sponsor of the Drupal Association, but I know you guys do so much more than that. And so I want you to share so people know, because I think it's really important that more companies get engaged and give back in more ways. Some of the ways that you guys contribute that people probably don't know about.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Because we don't have people who are like full-time on staff working on Drupal core. That's just not something that ever made sense for us to do. For a variety of reasons, but we do make a bunch of technical contributions that are actually about everything else around Drupal. So we've worked through a bunch of the things that are necessary in the Linux ecosystem to really support Drupal and like another PHP CMSs so that they can work well and they can work at scale. Some of the contributions we made to to curl and systemd and other of these like kind of like really like low level fundamental components that like Drupal sits on top of a whole stack of other open source tech, and frankly from a technical perspective we've given a lot more back to that underlying tech stack than to Drupal core itself in particular. We do make some other contributions too in terms of the security team and other things which are important. But yeah, I think it takes all kinds, right? And I think for us, as an operations platform for the web, right, frankly, like the internal skills we have within our engineering organization and the place where we spend most of our mental energy and time is at that platform layer, and so that's where most of our contributions go back in. And I think it's right that like for companies that want to give back, like where you give back should be a combination of like in your sweet spot of like where you legitimately have the skills and expertise to do, and it should be aligned with like your interests. Like I think it's fine if people want to sort of give back as a form of charity, but it's not particularly sustainable to like look at giving back to open source as a charitable activity, because as soon as push comes to shove, it'll always get like dialed down. You have to like giving back to open source should be strategic, in my opinion. And so yeah, and like beyond that, like there's other places where we make contributions, and we're actually building a team now internally to do this in a much more organized and sustainable fashion, to look at third-party contribution, third-party modules, third-party libraries, and so forth that need, again, very often, for our with our unique focus, not unique, but with our singular focus on helping people ensure like high performance and scalability in all the sites, because that's just fundamental table stakes for having a credible web presence. There's a lot of code that gets written in open source where the author does great work, but they're scratching their own itch in their particular use case. And it's like, yeah, it works for me on my laptop, or it works for me on my small website, and I'm very happy to give this back to the community and have other people use it. But it hasn't actually been it isn't actually set up to handle higher performance or large scale use cases. And but the good news is really often it's not a huge change to get it to work in a scalable way. And so if we can, the ability to make things work, make things like that, make those types of contributions so that there's less like, kind of foot guns out there in the open, in the contrib space where people like, oh, this looks like a great thing, let me turn this on, and something like your performance goes down, and you have to like frantically turn the thing off. We like to avoid those moments for people.
Wow. I think contribution back should be driven by self-interest, alignment of goals. I wholeheartedly believe that's the way that open source is going to be successful. Your first contribution to Drupal, do you remember, there are many ways to contribute to Drupal, as you said. Code is just one of them, but code is at the core of Drupal, and you've done hundreds of code commits to the platform. I'm curious, do you remember one of like your earliest commits and what that experience was like? Do you remember what you committed and how it went?
Yeah, I would be lying if I said for sure I remember the first line of code I contributed back, but there's the first kind of things that I felt like were meaningful and that I was proud to do. One was still today the only line, the only contrib that I have that's in Drupal core, and it's probably not even Drupal core anymore because it's probably been rewritten, but there was a bug with the comment preview functionality in Drupal 6. Oh, no, Drupal 5. and I was like, oh, I was annoyed by it with like clients, and I was like, I'm gonna figure out why this is happening. And it looks like turned out it was a one-line fix. It was just like somebody missed like a class attribute that was supposed to be applied to something. So I wrote it up as a patch, followed the instructions, sent it in, and it got committed. And actually, like, it felt really good. It was like, you know, a small thing, but it felt very meaningful to have like, okay, I've got one contribution in there. And then from like but in third party contrib land, like the most meaningful thing I think I did there was I wrote up the original version of the Varnish module, which ended up being taken over by Dick Olofsson, who did a much better job than I did at stewarding and like managing it going forward and handling contributions. But I wrote the first the original sort of instance of the Varnish contrib module to make, you know, a module to help Drupal and Varnish, and better yet, Pressflow and Varnish work well together. Yeah, so I think of those as my two, like, code. When you say code commits, those are the two things that come to mind. I probably had some other stuff to the event module too, but I don't remember it for sure.
You've made tremendous contributions to the community outside of code. What are you most proud of?
Oh, I mean, the single thing that I think I credibly did to help Drupal outside of the commercial stuff, like the commercial stuff does help, like popularizing Drupal, building it into successful things, evangelizing Drupal, that's real. But like the Drupal Dojo was like my, like, let's give back. And it was an intentional thing where I wanted to give back in a meaningful way. And it worked. It worked really, I mean, it worked much better than I thought it would, in a way that I think actually like I can see how it had really positive ripple effects. So this was in like 2007, which we had gotten ChapterThree off the ground. I felt like I had been leaning on the community really hard while getting ChapterThree off the ground. Just like, oh, we got to do this for a client. I don't know how it works. Let me go into IRC and beg. Or I need to hire somebody real quick. Let me like lean on the community. And I was like, okay, I got to balance the scales here somehow. And we had the groups.drupal.org had just gotten spun up. And I thought, let's use this. And what I'll do is, I'm not saying that I know everything, but I like, again, like I have this particular skill set, which is not like how do I build Drupal core, but it's how do I build a website for a use case with Drupal, right? And that was something that, like, that was what all the agencies were doing, but there wasn't a ton of like documentation around how to actually do that. There's lots of like, well, if you want to write a module in Abstract, here's how you go about doing it. And there wasn't like a clear thing of like, here's how the node hook system works. And if you're thinking about customizing a publication workflow, this is a way to imagine how the pieces stick together. Here's how you can put something in place. Here's how you debug it. And so what I landed on was, I'm just going to do these things. Like I'll do it every Sunday from my my bedroom in like remote Northern California, and I'll just live stream. I mean, at the time we cobbled together this tech stack from like a bunch of bits and pieces, but now it's like you just do it on Twitch, right? But we were like, we built it ourselves. I'll just live stream myself trying to code, making mistakes, figuring it out, and I'll have like the IRC channel open over here so I can take questions from people and respond. And like, it's literally exactly what Twitch is. And there are people that do live coding on Twitch now really successfully, but we just kind of assembled it ourselves, a while back. And what was amazing about it was, at first I thought, okay, I'll get like maybe 10 or 20 people that want to learn stuff, and I'll mentor them up through this process, and then I'll have done something. And we got like over 100 people by the third session, and then other people saying, I want to do this too. Can I guest in? Can I have a guest spot and do next Sunday? And so it just turned into this like really great community thing of people coming in and doing like presentations and kind of like showing their way of doing various things with Drupal. And for a good couple of years, it was a very active, like, self-propelling learning community that I know was helpful for a lot of people who were discovering Drupal at the time to get up to speed and to sort of feel confident using the platform.
It had a major impact for sure. All right, so a tough question here, a little controversial. What is your favorite feature or aspect of Drupal and your least favorite?
So You know, I'm gonna be I'm going to answer this from a developer's perspective, because that's still kind of how I feel Drupal is, like as code, less than as a like an admin UI. And it's the double-edged sword. I love the way that Drupal has done certain things to abstract and make pluggable, and I hate the way that Drupal has done certain things to abstract and make pluggable. And it's one of those. It's like a cliche engineering answer perspective of, you can just it's controversial because, like, people put a lot of work into doing these things, but I think you can take a step back. If you look back at history, where abstraction was a preemptive optimization, and ended up being a bunch of work that didn't yield much value and increased the complexity of the system in a way that didn't help anyone, or didn't help very many people, versus where the abstraction was like, oh no, that was the thing that we needed, and that, like, now enabled a whole ecosystem of new things to be built on top of it that like totally is rad. So, like, if I to answer it in controversial form, like, I would still go back to the core, the idea of node hooks, because that was it's just so powerful, so useful, like such a great way to get into like the decorator pattern of building things out. And like based on, this is what you do when you're managing a core, like, abstract content thing. It doesn't have to be a page, doesn't have to be a blog, doesn't have to be an event. It's a node of some type, and it goes through this series of processes and allows anything else to plug and play with it along that journey of being saved, edited, the whole CRUD journey, right? That's actually really smart. Like, that's an internal pattern that isn't in a lot of other content management systems, and frankly, everybody should copy. It's awesome. And there's other things that came after that with, like, entities and so forth, that are similar, like smart, really solid content oriented thing. If I was going to, like, point out something that I thought was not a great optimization, and has, every time I've had to deal with it, has led to, like, kind of pain and suffering, be like the database abstraction layer. Like, been way better off if everyone's just like, Drupal only runs on MySQL. Sorry, it's just that's all we support, because you would prevent confusion, you'd eliminate a bunch of code, you could lean into the things that MySQL does, and only in a certain way, and actually get value for the system, versus having to, like, settle for, like, the more abstract, just generic ANSI SQL feature set. And I think that was, like, a missed opportunity early on. Again, like, most of my, like, deep, like, Drupal opinions are not from the past few years. It's from, like, the time when I was, like, really involved in building sites, but I feel like that if I could go back in time and just say, let's not do database next generation, let's take the opposite path and say, like Drupal's going to lean into MySQL, I think it would have helped the project.
For Drupal to be around for another 20 years, what has to happen? Like, what do we need? What do we got to change?
I think the biggest things that probably need to happen for Drupal to thrive for another 20 years. I mean, I think Drupal will be around for another 20 years, pretty much no matter what. But in that, like, Dries sometimes had a set of keynotes where he was like, well, we do want to be around like cockroaches are still around, or we want to be around like we're a real part of the story. Because Drupal has enough of a footprint and enough, like, places where it's not going to disappear. But for Drupal to really be thriving in another 20 years, I think that it's not one thing from a technical standpoint, but, like, Drupal has to, like, attract a new generation of talent. That's hard to do. That's actually pretty difficult to achieve. But frankly, that's what it would take. Like, there's a lot of people that are about your and my age that were part of this community, and it's because we came up with Drupal, and it was formative in our careers, and we learned it when we were up and comers, and cut our teeth on it in a lot of ways. That doesn't happen now very much. And I think for Drupal to really be a thriving, vibrant thing, like the amount of, like, large scale business and an institutional investment in Drupal is going to keep it alive and like healthy for quite some time. But if Drupal needs to find a new a new wave of talent. And I think there's a way that could actually happen in the sort of next generation modern web development context where people want to build with people who are building the web now are increasingly, and for good reason, starting with like a user experience and building backwards from there. And that's why everyone's interested in headless and so forth, because they build back to needing a content management system, and then like, well, I don't want I've already built the user experience. I don't want the CMS to give me pages. I just want it to give me content. And there's a real gap in the market right now. There is no solid, widely supported, well understood, open source, headless content management system. It doesn't exist. And there are a bunch of like proprietary SaaS headless CMSs that are really good. And it's a stretch to think that like Drupal could fill that gap, because it's a pretty big gap to fill, but there's definitely an opening there for a CMS that can support the modern user experience development and do it in a way that's open source, which I think would be a really, really positive and awesome thing for Drupal to do, because people want to own their, you want to own your content model, you want to own your editorial workflow, you want to own your data. Those are all like really good pragmatic reasons to want open source for your content. But people also want a really great user experience, and they'll give up a lot to deliver a better user experience sometimes. So I don't know if that's actually feasible, or if it's even the right thing. There might be another path for Drupal too, but that's one that I see that could be interesting.
Wow. This is a tough question to ask, because I'm sure there are countless people that have helped you or influenced you along the way. And Drupal is a community, and one person is not a community. But if you had to single out one or maybe two people who were really influential in your Drupal journey as mentors, who would you think?
So yeah, I have like a super old timer answer. So it would be Chex and DWW, like old heads know. But it's like at the time that I was trying to build a mental model in my head of how Drupal worked, so that I could feel confident creating stuff with it. They were the two people who spent the most time typing back and forth with me in IRC until it started to click. And that really, so Karoli and Derek, I really owe them that debt of gratitude for being willing to just volunteer to teach me about this stuff. Yeah, so I'd say those are probably the two people that were the most like mentors for me in Drupal. There's a lot of people that I found very inspiring, but like in terms of like where I actually got the hands-on help, it was the two of them.
Yeah, both amazing people and brains. Karoli Chix was very influential in my career.
Yeah,
he was my first employee at Now Public. Worked with him for 7-8 years, and every day he managed to blow my mind. He was controversial but amazing, and I learned so much from the guy. I miss him a lot. All right, one last question. You've been overly generous with your time. Who should I interview next? When you think about people in the community that have been a major part of its history and success.
That's a great question. I would say, again, just sticking with like people that I feel like I had a some kind of closeness to, and that aren't like there's that might not have already. I'm going to try to get again another good deep cut. The hipster Drupal. I think you should try to track down Dmitry Gaskin.
Oh wow,
Dmitry G01.
Yeah, he
who like he like, I remember him coming in. He was like the child prodigy of Drupal. I remember him coming into, I think it was like DrupalCon DC or something like that, and like he got up on a step stool to be above the podium to give a talk to like 300 like adults, and he owned that room. Like he wrote a bunch of good code too, but I would just like a really, and he's in the Bay Area, so I met him a few times, as he was growing up, and like he's gone on to like, he went to Stanford, he's doing a startup now, he's doing great, but he was just a great, really fantastic individual, and like did a bunch of, I met him through the Drupal Dojo, and he did a bunch of really cool stuff and would be an interesting person to talk to.
That's an amazing recommendation. I remember that presentation. So, I mean, it's just the image of him, putting that stool in place and getting up, and then you said owning the room. It was amazing. He is a brilliant guy, and I will definitely reach out to him. Dude, I wish we could keep going. There's so many things that I would love to talk to you about, but like I said, you've been overly generous in your time. We're over time. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I know you're a really, really busy guy.
Yeah, well, no, I mean, it's my pleasure. And thanks for doing this project. Like, I think it's a really wonderful thing to do, to like, kind of at the 20-year mark, to collect these stories. And thanks for hosting this and giving me a chance to like reminisce about like some of like the funnest times of my career, to be honest. And like, the community has been a huge part of of our success, and it's also just like been a part of who we are as people. And so it's good to recognize that, and nice to remember all those things too.
Yeah, I'm going to try and do one a week between now and the end of the year. Every time I do one, I love it. Like I said, reminiscing, catching up. We lead busy lives with so much going on. It's great to see you. To our listeners, please make sure you check out the other interviews in the series, tag1.com/20. That's 20. If you like this talk, please remember to upvote, subscribe, and share it out. You can check out our other Tag1 Team Talks at tag1.com/talks. As always, we love your input, your feedback on this show, on people we should interview, other topics we should cover. You can reach us at talks@tag1.com. That's tag1.com. Josh, again, huge thank you for joining us. To everyone who tuned in, we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Michael.